Let us drift back now, through the gentle mists of time, to a world where stonemasons first dreamed of building something eternal. You don't need to remember every detail as we wander together through these quiet centuries. Just let the story carry you softly forward. It was around the year 900, in the peaceful countryside of medieval Europe, when the first whispers of permanent fortification began to stir in the minds of thoughtful lords. The wooden palisades that had protected their ancestors for generations were fine for their time, but something deeper was calling, a longing for structures that would outlast not just seasons, but centuries. Picture, if you will, a misty morning in early autumn. The lord of a modest estate stands on a gentle hill, his breath visible in the cool air, looking out over lands that his grandfather had cleared and his father had cultivated. The wooden towers that crown his modest manor have served well, but they show the patient wear of decades, timbers darkened by countless rains, joints loosened by the slow expansion and contraction of wood through seasons of heat and cold. There's no urgency in this moment, no crisis demanding immediate action. Instead, there's something far more profound at work, the quiet realization that some things are worth building to last forever. You may find yourself drifting as we explore this peaceful awakening, this gentle shift from temporary to eternal thinking that would reshape the landscape of Europe. In the libraries of monasteries scattered across this medieval world, ancient texts held secrets that few could read. Monks copying manuscripts by candlelight sometimes paused over descriptions of Roman engineering, their quills hovering above parchment as they contemplated techniques lost to their grandfather's generation. These weren't dramatic discoveries. Rather, they were quiet recognitions, like remembering a half-forgotten dream. The lord on his hill wasn't thinking of conquest or warfare as he imagined his stone castle. Instead, his mind wandered to his children and their children's children. He envisioned celebrations that would echo through halls built to last centuries. Imagine the comfort of knowing that winter storms would never again threaten the safety of those he protected. There's something deeply soothing about this patient, generational thinking, this willingness to begin something that might not be finished in one's own lifetime. As word of his intentions spread through the quiet village below, reactions were measured and thoughtful. The village mason, whose family had worked with stone for generations in smaller projects, repairing church walls, crafting tombstones, building foundations for mills, found his expertise suddenly precious. He would spend long evenings by his fire, sketching designs on smooth pieces of bark, calculating loads and stresses with the intuitive wisdom passed down through generations of craftsmen. The local priest, educated in the old learning, offered access to his small collection of books. Among them was a weather-worn volume containing descriptions of Roman building techniques, its pages soft with age and handling. Together, the lord and the mason would read by flickering candlelight, their conversations punctuated by long, comfortable silences as they contemplated the magnitude of what they were considering. You don't need to focus on the technical details. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of planning and dreaming that occupied these autumn evenings. There was no hurry, no pressure. The wooden walls would serve for another decade at least. This was planning for eternity, and eternity, by definition, could wait for proper preparation. As winter settled over the land, bringing with it the enforced quietude of short days and long nights, the planning continued. Sketches were refined, calculations double-checked, and letters were written to distant relatives who had heard rumors of stone castles rising in other regions. Each response brought new information, new techniques to consider, new possibilities to explore. The village blacksmith found himself studying his forge with new eyes, wondering how the techniques that shaped iron might inform the shaping of stone. The carpenter began experimenting with joint techniques that might adapt to the precise demands of stonework. Even the village miller, expert in the patient power of water and wind, offered thoughts on the lifting devices that would be needed to raise heavy stones to unprecedented heights. There's something wonderfully calming about this collaborative dreaming, This community of craftsmen slowly coalescing around a shared vision of permanence. No single person held all the knowledge needed, but together, their combined wisdom began to sketch the outline of possibility. As spring approached and the first flowers pushed through the last patches of snow, the planning had reached a natural completion. The dream had taken shape, not through dramatic breakthrough, but through the patient accumulation of small insights, careful calculations, and quiet conversations. The time for dreaming was drawing to a close, and the time for learning was about to begin. The Lord stood once again on his hill, but now his gaze moved beyond his own lands to the ancient ruins that dotted the countryside. Somewhere in those weathered stones lay the accumulated wisdom of builders who had solved these problems centuries before. The next phase of the journey would take them beyond planning and into the realm of practical learning, where Roman ghosts would teach medieval hands. As morning light filtered through those early planning chambers, other minds were already turning to the ancient knowledge that would guide their hands. Let's drift now to where the wisdom began. Whispers from Roman ruins. Elsewhere, in the quiet shadows of fallen Roman walls, curious craftsmen ran their weathered hands along ancient stones. You may find yourself drifting as we explore these peaceful ruins together. The morning mist clung to crumbling foundations scattered across the European countryside, remnants of an empire that had fallen 5 centuries past. Yet in their weathered surfaces, patient observers could still read the stories of master builders whose techniques had created structures so enduring that even in ruin, they commanded respect and wonder. Our medieval mason, accompanied by his lord and a small party of equally curious craftsmen, made his way along old Roman roads toward the nearest substantial ruins. These weren't dramatic expeditions. No fanfare marked their departure. No urgent timeline drove their progress. Instead, they traveled with the unhurried pace of pilgrims, stopping frequently to examine bridges, milestone markers, and boundary walls that had survived the centuries with remarkable grace. There's something deeply soothing about this kind of learning journey, where knowledge reveals itself gradually through patient observation rather than hurried study. You don't need to remember every technical detail. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of discovery that marked these quiet expeditions. The first major ruin they encountered had once been a Roman villa, its walls still standing to shoulder height in places. Here, the mason learned his first lesson in the difference between Roman ambition and medieval caution. Where he might have used smaller stones, carefully fitted but ultimately limited by what 2 men could reasonably lift, the Romans had employed massive blocks that must have required dozens of workers and elaborate lifting devices. Running his hands along joints that had remained tight for over 500 years, he began to understand something profound about Roman mortar. This wasn't the simple lime and sand mixture used in his grandfather's stonework. This was something more sophisticated, a binding agent that seemed to have grown stronger rather than weaker with age. He scraped small samples into leather pouches, planning to experiment with different mixtures once he returned home. The Lord, meanwhile, found himself fascinated by the Roman approach to site selection. This villa commanded views in all directions, but it was positioned for beauty and convenience rather than pure defense. The Romans had built with the confidence of those who expected their peace to last forever, a confidence that proved misplaced, perhaps, but which resulted in structures of remarkable elegance and comfort. As they continued their gentle pilgrimage, moving from ruin to ruin across the peaceful countryside, patterns began to emerge. Roman builders had understood something about the relationship between stone and earth that medieval craftsmen were only beginning to rediscover. Foundations went deeper than seemed necessary, extending below the frost line with a thoroughness that spoke of builders who thought in geological timescales. You may already be drifting off as we wander through these ancient lessons, where knowledge passed not through books or speeches, but through the patient teaching of stones themselves. Each wall told its story to those willing to listen. Each fallen arch demonstrated principles of engineering that could be adapted to medieval needs. At the ruins of an ancient bathhouse, the mason encountered his first Roman arch still intact after centuries of weather. Walking beneath it, feeling the perfect distribution of weight through carefully cut stones, he experienced something close to revelation. Here was a technique that could span greater distances than any wooden beam, support more weight than any simple post and lintel construction, and do it all with an elegance that seemed to defy the basic properties of stone. The party spent an entire afternoon in the shadow of that arch, the mason sketching its proportions while the carpenter measured angles, and the Lord simply sat in contemplation. There was no hurry to this learning. Each insight needed time to settle. Each technique required patient consideration before it could be adapted to their own purposes. As evening approached, and they made camp among the ruins, their conversations turned to the people who had built these marvels. Who were these Roman engineers who thought so far ahead, who planned so carefully for posterity? What drove them to invest such enormous effort in structures meant to outlast their own lifetimes by centuries? The answers, they realized, lay not in any mysterious superior knowledge, but in a simple commitment to excellence and permanence. Roman builders had approached their craft with the same care that their medieval counterparts brought to illuminated manuscripts or fine metalwork. Every detail considered, every technique refined through generations of practice. Around their small campfire, as stars emerged in the clear medieval sky, the mason began to understand that he wasn't just learning techniques. He was inheriting a tradition of craftsmanship that connected him across centuries to master builders whose names were lost, but whose work continued to teach and inspire. The next morning brought discovery of an aqueduct, its arches marching across a valley with mathematical precision. Here was Roman engineering at its most practical and beautiful, a structure that solved complex problems of elevation and flow while creating something that enhanced rather than scarred the landscape. Following the aqueduct to its source, they found springs that had been carefully channeled and protected, their flow regulated by simple but ingenious devices that had continued to function long after the empire that built them had crumbled. The lesson was clear. The best engineering worked with natural forces rather than against them, channeling and directing rather than simply overpowering. As their informal pilgrimage drew to a close, the mason's leather satchel contained not just samples of Roman mortar and sketches of Roman arches, but something more valuable, a new understanding of what was possible when craftsmen thought beyond their own lifetimes and built for the ages. The journey home was marked by a different kind of conversation. Where the outward journey had been filled with questions and wonder, the return was characterized by planning and adaptation. How could Roman techniques be modified for medieval needs? What materials could substitute for Roman imports no longer available? How could the lessons of the past inform the dreams of the future? As these gentle lessons from the past settled in their minds, the need for proper foundations began to whisper its importance. Let's wander now to where it all begins. The patient art of foundation dreams. Deep beneath where mighty walls would someday stand, patient men with simple tools began the most important work of all. There's something deeply soothing about this slow, careful beginning. The spring morning arrived with unusual warmth for the season, and with it came the quiet ceremony that would mark the true beginning of construction. No grand fanfare announced this moment. Instead, a small group of craftsmen gathered on the chosen hilltop, their breath still visible in the cool air, their tools arranged with the careful precision of those who understood that everything depended on getting this first step exactly right. The master mason knelt beside a wooden stake driven into the earth, its placement the result of weeks of careful measurement and consideration. From this single point, the entire castle would grow, each wall and tower positioned according to calculations that existed only in his mind and in rough sketches drawn on precious parchment. There's something wonderfully meditative about this moment of pure potential, when years of planning crystallize into the first deliberate action. You don't need to focus on the technical details of surveying. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of measurement and marking that would occupy the next several weeks. Using techniques learned from Roman ruins and refined through generations of medieval practice, the craftsmen began the slow process of marking the castle's footprint on the patient earth. Wooden stakes connected by taut rope began to trace the outline of walls that existed only in imagination. The mason walked these boundaries again and again, his practiced eye checking angles and proportions, his mind calculating loads and stresses that wouldn't be tested for years to come. Each stake was driven with ceremony, each measurement checked and double-checked, because foundations, once laid, could never be moved. As the outline took shape, work began on the most crucial and invisible part of the entire project, the excavation of foundation trenches. This wasn't the dramatic earth-moving of modern construction, but rather the patient work of men with shovels and picks, removing soil one careful shovelful at a time. The digging revealed the personality of the hill itself. Here, the earth was soft and loamy, requiring deeper excavation to reach stable ground. There, unexpected stone appeared just below the surface, a gift from the hill that would save both time and effort. Each discovery was noted, each variation accommodated in the flexible planning that characterized medieval construction. You may find yourself drifting as we watch this patient excavation, where progress was measured not in hours but in days, not in dramatic breakthrough, but in the steady accumulation of cubic yards of earth carefully removed and just as carefully set aside for later use. There's something deeply calming about work that proceeds at the pace of seasons rather than the rush of modern urgency. As the trenches deepened, reaching toward the frost line that the mason had learned to respect during his pilgrimage to Roman ruins, the true foundation work began. This was where Roman lessons proved most valuable. The understanding that a castle's strength began not with its towers or walls, but with its connection to the earth itself. The first stones laid were not the dressed blocks that would form the visible walls, but rough field stones carefully selected for their size and shape. These foundation stones would never be seen by anyone except the craftsmen who placed them, yet they were chosen and positioned with the same care that would later be lavished on decorative carvings. Each stone was set in a bed of mortar, mixed according to recipes refined through generations of trial and error. The mortar itself was a minor miracle. Lime burned in kilns that glowed through long nights. Sand selected for its particular properties, water added with the precision of a master chef seasoning a feast. The resulting mixture would bind these stones together more firmly than nature had ever bound them in their original hillsides. Layer by layer, course by course, the foundations rose from their trenches. The work proceeded with the unhurried patience of men who understood that this phase of construction, invisible though it would eventually be, was the most critical of all. A mistake here could bring down walls decades in the future, could compromise the safety of generations yet unborn. The mason moved among his workers like a conductor guiding a quiet orchestra, checking each stone's placement, testing each batch of mortar, ensuring that the foundation rose level and true. His hands, roughened by years of working with stone, could detect variations in texture and stability that would be invisible to untrained eyes. As summer progressed and the foundations slowly emerged from the earth, reaching toward ground level, the character of the future castle began to reveal itself. The massive thickness of the foundation walls spoke of structures that would rise to unprecedented heights. The careful buttressing at corners promised towers that would command views for miles in every direction. There's something wonderfully reassuring about this phase of construction, where everything was built to last not just years, but centuries. The craftsmen working on these foundations knew that their great-grandchildren might walk on stones they were laying today, that the decisions they made in these patient summer days would echo through generations. The foundation work attracted visitors from neighboring villages, not crowds, but individuals drawn by curiosity about techniques that few had seen before. The village priest blessed the work with quiet ceremony. Children played among the piles of stone, their laughter mixing with the steady sounds of construction in a way that made the entire enterprise feel like a natural part of the landscape's evolution. As autumn approached and the foundations neared completion, the mason could finally stand back and survey, would have been accomplished. To untrained eyes, it might have looked like simple stone walls barely emerging from the earth. But to those who understood construction, these foundations represented months of perfect work, a platform of absolute reliability upon which dreams could safely rise. The final stones of the foundation were laid with particular ceremony. These would be the last foundation stones anyone would ever see, for soon they would be buried beneath the rising walls of the castle proper. Yet they were placed with the same care as every stone before them, because the men who laid them understood that true craftsmanship admits no shortcuts, recognizes no hidden corners where lesser work might suffice. As the years quietly passed and foundations settled into the patient earth, thoughts began to turn toward the stone that would rise above. Let's drift gently to where the mountains held their treasures. The gentle quarrying of stone. In distant hillsides, where morning mist clung to ancient rock faces, quiet quarrymen learned to listen to the stone itself. You don't need to hold onto every detail. Just let the steady rhythm of their work carry you along. The search for perfect stone began long before the first foundation trench was dug. While the mason and his lord were still dreaming of towers and walls, scouts were already wandering the gentle hills and valleys within a day's journey of the castle's site, their trained eyes reading the landscape for signs of the treasure that lay hidden beneath soil and vegetation. Stone, the quarryman knew, was not simply stone. Each type had its own personality, its own strengths and weaknesses, its own preferred uses in the grand symphony of construction. Limestone, soft enough to carve yet durable enough to last centuries, was prized for decorative work and interior walls. Sandstone, with its warm colors and reliable structure, made excellent building blocks for walls that would face the weather. Granite, hardest of all, was reserved for foundations and corners where strength mattered more than workability. The limestone quarry lay in a peaceful valley half a day's journey from the castle site, its location revealed by a spring that bubbled up through characteristic rock formations. Here, generations of quarrymen had learned to read the stone's natural grain, to understand how water and frost had prepared certain blocks for easy removal, while leaving others stubbornly attached to their mother rock. You may already be drifting off as we explore this quiet world of stone and patient craftsmen, where work proceeded at the pace of seasons and understanding developed over lifetimes of careful observation. The head quarryman, a man whose grandfather had worked these same stone faces, possessed knowledge that could never be written down, an intuitive understanding of how stone wanted to break, where natural fractures lay hidden, which blocks would split cleanly, and which would crumble at the first touch of chisel and hammer. The quarrying process began each morning with a ritual older than memory. The quarrymen would walk the rock face, their hands reading the stone's surface like a manuscript, their ears listening for the subtle sounds that revealed internal structure. A hollow ring here indicated a natural cavity. A solid thunk, their promised stone of exceptional quality. The practiced, I could spot the nearly invisible lines that marked natural fracture planes, the places where patient pressure would yield perfect building blocks. The tools of quarrying were simple but perfectly adapted to their purpose. Iron wedges, their edges honed to razor sharpness, were driven into natural cracks with wooden mallets that delivered precise, controlled blows. Wooden wedges, soaked in water that would freeze on cold nights, provided the patient pressure that could split massive stones along their natural grain. Long iron pry bars, worn smooth by generations of hands, gave leverage that could move blocks weighing more than a team of oxen. There's something deeply meditative about quarry work, where progress was measured not in hours but in days, where each block required patient study before the first tool was applied. The quarrymen developed relationships with individual stones, learning their characteristics through long observation, planning their extraction with the care of surgeons preparing for delicate operations. The limestone yielded most readily to their patient techniques. Natural bedding plains, formed over millions of years, as ancient seas deposited layer upon layer of compressed shells and coral, provided convenient breaking points. The quarrymen learned to read these layers like the pages of a book, understanding which would provide blocks of perfect size for castle walls, which are better suited for smaller applications. Each extracted block was examined with the critical eye of a master craftsman. Surface flaws that might admit water and frost were noted and marked. Internal structure was tested with gentle taps that revealed hidden weaknesses. Color variations, caused by different mineral content, were cataloged for future use in decorative applications. Only blocks that met the highest standards were marked for transport to the castle site. The sandstone quarry, located in hills that caught the morning sun, provided stone of a different character entirely. Here, ancient desert sands have been compressed and cemented into rock of warm, golden color that seemed to glow with inner light. This stone was harder than limestone, more difficult to extract, but rewarded patience with blocks of exceptional beauty and durability. Working the sandstone required different techniques, adapted to stone that fractured differently than limestone. Natural joints, formed by geological stresses over millions of years, provided the key to extraction. The quarrymen learned to follow these joints, using them as guides to free blocks that might otherwise require dangerous amounts of force to extract. You don't need to focus on the technical details of stone extraction. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of ancient techniques applied with patient skill. The quarrymen worked with the unhurried confidence of those who understood that stone had waited millions of years to be discovered. It could wait a few more days to be extracted properly. As blocks accumulated in the quarry yard, they were sorted and graded according to their intended uses. The finest pieces, with perfect color and flawless structure, were reserved for decorative work and important structural elements. Good quality blocks were designated for general wall construction. Even flawed stones found their purpose in foundations or interior work where appearance mattered less than strength. The granite quarry, hardest and most challenging of all, lay in hills that had been formed in the earth's violent youth. Here, quarrying was less about following natural fractures and more about creating them through patient application of heat and cold, expansion and contraction. Fires built against the rock face, followed by sudden cooling with water, created stresses that could split even the hardest granite along predetermined lines. Working granite required not just skill, but courage, for the forces needed to break such hard stone could be dangerous if not properly controlled. The quarrymen approached each granite block with the respect due to a worthy opponent, planning each cut with meticulous care, applying force with surgical precision. As autumn progressed and the quarries yielded their treasures, wagons began their patient journeys between quarry and castle site. Each load was precious cargo, representing days of skilled work and careful selection. The quarrymen took pride in knowing that stones they had freed from ancient hillsides would stand as testimony to their skill for centuries to come. With wagon loads of patient stone making their slow journey across gentle countryside, the castle site began to stir with quiet purpose. Let's drift now to where the real work began, the meditation of moving stone. Along winding medieval paths, great oxen pulled their precious cargo with the unhurried wisdom of centuries. There's something deeply calming about this patient procession. The transportation of stone from quarry to castle site became a meditation in itself, a slow dance between human ingenuity and natural forces that unfolded across the gentle countryside throughout the building seasons. Each massive block, freed from its ancient resting place in distant quarries, began a journey that might take days to complete, carried by methods that had evolved through generations of patient refinement. The wagons themselves were marvels of medieval engineering, their massive wooden wheels bound with iron rims that had been heated and shrunk into place by skilled blacksmiths. These wheels, some as tall as a man, were carved from solid oak and reinforced with iron spokes that could bear tremendous loads without breaking. The wagon beds, constructed from the heaviest timbers available, were designed not for speed, but for the patient transport of loads that would challenge even modern vehicles. You don't need to remember the technical details of medieval transport. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of oxen and wheels, the patient procession that connected quarry to construction site across miles of peaceful countryside. The great oxen, bred for strength rather than speed, pulled their loads with the unhurried majesty of creatures who understood that some things could not be rushed. Each journey began before dawn, when the air was cool and the roads were firm with overnight moisture. The ox drivers, men whose families had worked with these patient beasts for generations, understood the subtle signals that indicated when an ox was tiring, when a load was shifting, when a rest was needed. Their relationship with their animals was based on mutual respect and understanding developed over years of shared labor. The largest stones required special handling, loads so massive that a single block might fill an entire wagon. These giants, destined to become cornerstones or foundation blocks for the castle's most important structures, were wrapped in rope and leather to protect them from damage during transport. Wooden rollers, cut from straight oak trees and polished smooth by use, were positioned beneath the stones to ease their loading and unloading. The loading process itself was a ceremony of patient engineering. Wooden ramps, built specifically for each quarry site, allowed the heavy blocks to be rolled rather than lifted onto the waiting wagons. Teams of men with ropes and levers worked in perfect coordination, their movements synchronized by work songs that have been passed down through generations of stone movers. There's something wonderfully soothing about this ancient choreography of human cooperation, where dozens of men worked as one to accomplish what no individual could manage alone. The loading of a single massive stone might take an entire morning, but it was accomplished without haste, without stress, with the patient confidence of those who knew that careful preparation prevented dangerous accidents. Once loaded, the wagon began its slow journey across the medieval landscape. The roads, little more than packed earth tracks in many places, required careful navigation to avoid the soft spots that could trap a heavily loaded wagon for days. The ox drivers knew every hill and valley along their routes, understood which paths were passable after rain and which required waiting for drier conditions. The pace was deliberate, measured miles per day rather than miles per hour. A loaded stone wagon might cover only 5 or 6 miles in a full day's travel, stopping frequently to rest the oxen, to check the security of the load, to navigate particularly challenging terrain. These weren't delays or inefficiencies. They were simply the natural rhythm of working with materials and forces that demanded respect. You may find yourself drifting as we follow these patient processions across the peaceful countryside, where the sound of wooden wheels on packed earth mixed with the gentle lowing of oxen and the quiet conversations of men who had learned to find contentment in slow, steady progress. Villages along the route often turned out to watch these impressive loads pass by, children running alongside the wagons in excitement, adults offering encouragement and sometimes assistance. The unloading process, when the wagons finally reached the castle site, was as carefully choreographed as the loading had been. Wooden ramps were constructed to ease the stones from wagon bed to ground, and teams of workers used the same patient techniques of ropes and rollers to position each block precisely where the master mason directed. Some stones were destined for immediate use in the rising walls. Others were set aside in carefully organized piles, sorted by size and quality for future use. Each block was positioned with its best face toward the sky, protected from weather by wooden covers during the months or even years it might wait before finding its permanent place in the castle structure. The smaller stones, though easier to transport, required their own specialized handling. Wagons designed for lighter loads could carry dozens of dressed blocks in a single journey, but each stone still required careful securing to prevent damage during transport. Straw and leather padding protected finished surfaces from scratches and chips that could compromise the stone's fitness for use in visible walls. For the most valuable stones, decorative blocks destined for window frames, door surrounds, or carved details, special care was taken throughout the transport process. These stones were often wrapped individually in leather and wool, cushioned against shock, and transported in smaller loads to minimize the risk of damage. The carvers who would eventually work these stones often accompanied the wagons personally, their trained eyes watching for any signs of stress or damage that might affect their future work. The rhythm of stone transport continued throughout the building seasons, year after year, creating a steady stream of material that fed the patient appetite of construction. In spring, when roads were soft with snow melt, only the lightest loads could move safely. Summer brought optimal conditions for transport, with firm roads and long days allowing maximum progress. Autumn required careful timing to complete deliveries before winter weather made the roads impassable. Winter itself brought a different kind of activity, as the transported stones were sorted, cleaned, and prepared for the next building season. This was when the masons had time to examine each block carefully, to plan its use in the growing structure, to identify any stones that required special cutting or shaping before they could be incorporated into the walls. The entire process of stone transport created its own community of specialized workers: ox drivers, wagon makers, rope weavers, and the countless others whose skills supported the patient movement of stone across the medieval landscape. Each played their part in the great collaboration that was slowly raising a castle from the dreams of one man to the reality of stone and mortar. As stone after stone found its resting place beside the growing foundation, skilled hands began to shape what nature had provided. Let's wander softly to the mason's peaceful domain, the mason's quiet craft. In the gentle morning light, master masons took up their well-worn tools, beginning another day of patient conversation with stone. You may already be drifting off as we watch their careful, rhythmic work. The Mason's Lodge, a simple wooden structure erected near the castle construction site, became the quiet heart of the entire building project. Here, surrounded by the tools and traditions of centuries, master craftsmen transformed rough stone into precisely fitted building blocks, each one shaped with the personal care of an artist creating a lasting masterpiece. The morning ritual began before dawn, as the master mason examined the stones that had been selected for the day's work. His hands, roughened by decades of working with stone, could read the character of each block through touch alone. Here, a hidden flaw that might cause problems during cutting. There, a grain that would make the stone particularly suitable for a corner where precise angles were crucial. Each stone told its story to those who knew how to listen. The tools of the mason's trade were simple, but perfectly evolved for their purpose. Chisels of various sizes, their iron edges honed to razor sharpness, could remove stone with surgical precision or rough shape a block with powerful blows. Mallets of different weights, some carved from dense hardwood, others forged from iron, delivered exactly the force needed for each type of cut. Measuring devices, squares, levels, and straight edges ensured that human precision matched the exactness demanded by stone construction. You don't need to focus on the technical details of stone cutting. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of chisel on stone, the patient conversation between craftsman and material that would continue throughout the long building seasons. There's something deeply meditative about this work, where progress was measured not in hours, but in perfectly fitted stones, each one a small victory of human skill over natural resistance. The apprentice masons, young men learning the ancient craft under the watchful eyes of masters, began each day with the most basic tasks: sharpening tools, preparing mortar, sorting stones by size and quality. These simple duties taught patience and attention to detail that would serve them throughout their careers. Even the youngest apprentice understood that there were no shortcuts in stone masonry, no substitute for careful, methodical work. The master mason approached each stone as an individual challenge, studying its natural characteristics before making the first cut. Some stones revealed their secrets immediately: clear grain, predictable structure, materials that responded willingly to skilled hands. Others were more mysterious, requiring patient exploration to understand how they wanted to be shaped, what uses would best serve their particular strengths. The cutting process itself was a form of sculpture, removing everything that was not needed to reveal the perfect building block that lay hidden within the rough stone. The masons trained, I could visualize the finished block even before the first chisel stroke, seeing through surface irregularities to the geometric perfection that careful work would reveal. Each cut was planned and executed with deliberate precision. The mason would mark the stone with chalk or charcoal, indicating where material needed to be removed. Then, with chisel and mallet, he would begin the patient process of liberation, freeing the building block from the excess stone that surrounded it. The rhythm of this work, the sharp tap of mallet on chisel, followed by the ring of iron on stone, created a music that filled the mason's lodge from dawn to dusk. There's something wonderfully soothing about this ancient rhythm, where human intention and natural material found harmony through patient collaboration. You may find yourself drifting as we watch the master masons at their quiet work, their movements economical and precise, their focus absolute but never hurried. The different types of stone required different approaches to cutting and shaping. Limestone, soft and cooperative, yielded readily to sharp tools and could be carved with fine detail. Sandstone, harder but more predictable, required more force but rewarded careful work with blocks of exceptional durability. Granite, hardest of all, demanded not just skill but strategy, with cuts planned to work with the stone's natural structure rather than against it. As each block neared completion, the mason's attention turned to the fine details that would determine how well it fit with its neighbors in the castle wall. Edges were checked for straightness and proper angles. Surfaces were smoothed to ensure good contact with mortar. The bed and build, the bottom and top surfaces of each block, were prepared with particular care, since these would bear the weight of all the stones above. The master mason's most important skill was perhaps his ability to visualize how each stone would fit into the larger structure. He worked not just with individual blocks, but with courses of stone that would span entire wall sections. Each stone had to be not only perfect in itself, but perfectly compatible with its neighbors, contributing to the strength and stability of the whole wall. Apprentices learned by watching and gradually taking on more complex tasks. First, they might be trusted to rough-shape simple blocks under close supervision. Later, they would progress to more precise work, eventually learning to cut the complex shapes needed for arches, corners, and decorative elements. The learning process took years, but it produced craftsmen whose skills would serve them throughout long careers. The Mason's Lodge was also a place of quiet conversation and shared knowledge. Here, techniques were passed down from master to apprentice. Problems were discussed and solved collaboratively, and innovations were tested and refined. The masters understood that they were not just shaping stone, but preserving and advancing a tradition of craftsmanship that stretched back through centuries. As the day's work progressed and finished blocks accumulated in neat piles, each stone was marked with the mason's personal symbol, a small carved sign that identified its creator. This wasn't mere pride, but practical necessity, since payment was often based on the number of finished blocks each mason produced. More importantly, these marks connected each anonymous craftsman to the permanent structure he was helping to create. The afternoon brought different rhythms, as the masons turned their attention to more complex work. The special stones needed for window openings, door frames, and architectural details. These required not just technical skill, but artistic judgment, as the mason transformed functional building blocks into elements of beauty that would be admired for centuries to come. As evening approached and the tools were cleaned and stored, the master mason would walk among the day's production, checking each stone one final time before it was approved for use in the castle walls. Only blocks that met his exacting standards would be marked as ready for the layers of stone that were slowly rising from the completed foundations. As perfectly fitted stones began to accumulate like a growing poem, attention turned to the ancient art of holding them together. Let's drift now to the mystery of medieval mortar, the alchemy of mortar and lime. In quiet lime kilns that glowed gently through long nights, ancient alchemy transformed simple stone into the binding force of empires. There's no need to understand it all. Just let the warm glow of those patient fires comfort you. The creation of mortar was perhaps the most mysterious and crucial aspect of castle construction, a process that transformed ordinary limestone into a binding agent strong enough to hold massive walls together for centuries. In the gentle glow of lime kilns, medieval craftsmen practiced an alchemy that seemed almost magical, burning stone to create powder that, when mixed with water, would become harder than the original stone itself. The lime kilns stood like small volcanoes on the landscape near the castle site, their stone-lined chambers designed to burn at precisely the right temperature for days at a time. These weren't dramatic industrial furnaces, but rather patient structures that worked with the slow rhythms of medieval life, transforming limestone through heat and time rather than overwhelming force. The process began with the careful selection of limestone specifically chosen for lime burning. Not all limestone was suitable. The master lime burner knew to select stone that was pure, free from impurities that might weaken the final product. These limestone blocks were broken into pieces roughly the size of a man's fist, each piece examined to ensure it met the exacting standards that would determine the quality of mortar used throughout the castle. You don't need to follow every technical detail of lime burning. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of this ancient process, where fire and stone collaborated to create something entirely new. The lime burner was a craftsman as skilled as any mason, his knowledge passed down through generations of careful observation and patient experimentation. Loading the kiln was a ceremony in itself. Layers of limestone alternated with layers of carefully selected fuel, charcoal, wood, sometimes coal when it was available. The arrangement followed patterns learned through centuries of practice, ensuring that heat would distribute evenly throughout the limestone, burning each piece thoroughly without wasting fuel or overheating the kiln walls. The firing process required constant attention for 3 to 5 days, during which the lime burner or his assistants maintained a continuous watch. The temperature had to be kept just right, hot enough to drive off the carbon dioxide that held the limestone together, but not so hot as to overburn the lime and create a product that would never properly slake with water. There's something deeply meditative about this patient tending of the lime kiln, where the craftsman learned to read the subtle signs that indicated how the burning was progressing. The color of the flames, the sound of the fire, even the smell of the smoke, all provided information to the experienced lime burner about what was happening deep within the kiln chamber. As the limestone burned, it underwent a fundamental transformation. The solid rock that had formed over millions of years in ancient seas was broken down by heat, releasing carbon dioxide and leaving behind quicklime, a substance so reactive that it would burn skin on contact and burst in a violent reaction when mixed with water. This dangerous powder was the key ingredient in mortar that would outlast empires. The cooling process was as critical as the burning. The kiln had to be allowed to cool gradually, protecting the newly created quicklime from moisture that could cause premature slaking and ruin the entire batch. This cooling might take several days, during which the lime burner maintained his patient vigil, testing the temperature and protecting his precious product from rain or excessive humidity. You may find yourself drifting as we watch this ancient transformation, where simple materials were combined with knowledge and patience to create something that seemed almost magical in its properties. The medieval lime burner understood chemistry without naming it, practicing engineering without formal education, creating materials that modern science can barely improve upon. When the cooling was complete, the quicklime was carefully extracted from the kiln and stored in dry conditions until needed. This storage required careful attention, since quicklime would absorb moisture from the air and gradually lose its potency if not properly protected. Stone buildings, wooden boxes, even underground pits were used to preserve the lime until the moment came to transform it into mortar. The slaking process, mixing the quicklime with water to create lime putty, was perhaps the most dramatic moment in the entire mortar-making process. When water touched the quicklime, the reaction was immediate and violent. The mixture boiled and steamed, generating tremendous heat as the lime eagerly absorbed water and expanded into a smooth, plastic paste. The master mortar maker approached this process with the respect due to forces that could be dangerous if not properly controlled. The water was added gradually, in carefully measured amounts, while the mixture was stirred constantly to ensure even slaking throughout. Too much water too quickly could cause the mixture to boil over. Too little water left unslaked lime that would continue to expand and crack the mortar after it was used in the walls. The resulting lime putty was stored in pits or tanks, where it would age like fine wine. The longer the lime putty aged, the smoother and more workable it became. Some masons preferred lime putty that had aged for months or even years, believing that this patience resulted in superior mortar that would bond more strongly with stone and last longer under weather. When the time came to create mortar for actual construction, the aged lime putty was mixed with sand in proportions that varied according to the intended use. Fine mortar for pointing joints between stones required the purest sand, carefully washed and graded. Coarser mortar for backing walls could use less refined sand, but the proportions still required careful attention to achieve the proper consistency and strength. The mixing process itself was a skill that took years to master. The mortar maker learned to judge by sight and feel when the mixture achieved the perfect consistency. Wet enough to work easily, but not so wet as to squeeze out from between stones under pressure. The color, texture, and even the sound of the mortar as it was mixed provided clues to its quality and readiness for use. Different applications required different mortar recipes. Mortar for underwater construction included special ingredients that would set even when submerged. Mortar for extreme weather conditions might include additives that improved its resistance to frost and heat. The master mortar maker maintained a mental library of recipes, each one refined through generations of experience and adapted to specific needs. With mortar mixed and stones prepared, the first courses began their eternal climb toward the sky. Let's drift upward now with those rising walls. The first stones rise. Stone by patient stone, the first walls began their slow ascent from the earth, each block finding its destined place in an eternal puzzle. You don't need to follow every detail. Just feel the steady, upward rhythm. The morning when the first course of stones was laid above the completed foundations marked a profound moment in the castle's birth. The transformation from invisible preparation to visible progress. The master mason stood beside the cornerstone that would anchor the entire structure, his weathered hands tracing its perfectly cut edges one final time before it found its permanent home. The cornerstone itself was a masterpiece of the mason's art, cut with angles so precise that they seemed to mock the rough tools that had shaped them. This single block, weighing more than several men could lift, would bear the accumulated weight of centuries, supporting not just the stones above it, but the dreams and aspirations of generations yet unborn. Its placement was a ceremony of quiet significance, witnessed by the Lord, the master craftsman, and the workers who had labored through the long months of foundation work. The mortar bed had been prepared with meticulous care, spread evenly across the foundation stones, and checked for level with instruments that traced their lineage back to Roman engineering. The consistency was perfect, wet enough to allow adjustment of the stone's position, firm enough to support its massive weight without squeezing out under pressure. This was mortar made from lime that had aged for months, mixed with sand selected grain by grain for its purity and strength. You may find yourself drifting as we watch this ancient ritual of placement, where human hands guided stones that would outlast empires into their destined positions. The cornerstone was lowered with infinite care, its progress controlled by ropes and wooden levers that distributed its weight evenly. As it settled into the mortar bed, excess mixture squeezed out around its edges, a sign that the joint was properly filled and would bond stone to stone with unbreakable strength. The sound of stone meeting mortar was barely audible, yet marked a moment of profound significance. This was the first visible proof that the castle was more than dream or plan. It was becoming reality, one carefully placed stone at a time. The master mason checked the stone's position with his level and square, making tiny adjustments that would be invisible to casual observers, but would ensure that every subsequent course would rise true and straight. With the cornerstone in place, the first course began to stretch away along the lines marked by stakes and string. Each stone had been selected not just for its individual quality, but for how it would work with its neighbors to create a wall of unshakable strength. The joints between stones were staggered, following patterns that distributed weight and stress in ways that had been proven through centuries of construction. The rhythm of laying stone developed naturally as the work progressed. One mason would position and level each block, while another prepared the mortar bed for the next stone. Apprentices carried tools and materials, cleaned excess mortar from joints, and learned through observation the countless small skills that separated adequate stonework from craftsmanship that would endure for ages. There's something wonderfully meditative about this steady progression of stone upon stone, where each placement was both an individual achievement and part of a larger pattern that would not be complete for years to come. The masons worked with the patient confidence of those who understood that perfection could not be rushed, that each stone properly placed made all subsequent work easier and stronger. As the first course neared completion, stretching from corner to corner in a perfect line, the character of the future castle began to reveal itself in stone rather than imagination. The massive thickness of the walls spoke of structures built to last millennia. The careful bonding of inner and outer faces promised walls that would remain solid even if their surfaces were damaged by weather or time. The second course required even greater care than the first, since its stones would establish the vertical alignment that would guide every subsequent course. Each block was positioned to bridge the joints of the course below, creating an interlocking pattern that distributed loads evenly throughout the wall. The master mason moved constantly along the growing wall, checking alignment, testing the security of each stone, ensuring that the wall rose as straight and true as his instruments could measure. The mortar joints themselves became works of art under the skilled hands of the masons. Each joint was pointed with tools that created subtle grooves and textures, not merely for appearance, but to shed water and prevent frost damage. The mortar was worked while it was still plastic, shaped to create surfaces that would direct rainwater away from the wall, rather than allowing it to penetrate into the stonework. You don't need to remember the technical details of wall construction. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of stones finding their permanent homes, each one placed with the care of a craftsman who knew his work would be judged by centuries rather than seasons. The sound of trowel on stone, the quiet conversations of masons checking each other's work, the patient scraping away of excess mortar, all combined to create a peaceful symphony of purposeful construction. As the wall gained height, course by course, the practical challenges of construction began to reveal themselves. Stones had to be lifted higher, requiring stronger backs and more complex systems of ropes and pulleys. Mortar had to be mixed in smaller batches to prevent it from setting before it could be used. The careful choreography of construction had to accommodate the growing vertical distance between the ground and the working surface. But these challenges were met with the same patient ingenuity that had solved every previous problem. Wooden platforms were constructed to bring materials to the proper height. Stronger hoisting devices were built to lift stones safely. The rhythm of construction adapted to new requirements without losing its essential character of careful, methodical progress. The growing walls began to cast shadows that had never existed before, creating new patterns of light and shade that changed throughout the day. These shadows spoke of permanence, of structures that would mark the passage of seasons and years with their patient presence. Workers began to use these shadows as natural sundials, measuring the progress of their workday by the movement of shade across the ground. As evening approached and the day's work was completed, the master mason would walk the length of the new wall, checking joints, testing the security of each stone, planning the next day's work. His trained eye could spot problems invisible to others. A joint that might admit water, a stone that hadn't seated properly, a course that deviated slightly from true. These small imperfections were corrected immediately, for the mason understood that problems allowed to remain would only grow worse with time. The completed courses were covered with wet sacks or straw to protect the fresh mortar from too rapid drying, which could weaken the bond between stone and mortar. This protection would remain for days, until the mortar had cured sufficiently to bear the weight of additional courses above. Patience was not merely a virtue in stone construction. It was an absolute necessity. As the walls gained their first gentle height, wooden frameworks began to appear like skeletal dreams of what was to come. Let's drift now to the carpenter's quiet domain. Wooden dreams and timber scaffolds. Around the growing stone, master carpenters wove intricate wooden webs, temporary structures that would cradle permanent dreams. There's something wonderfully soothing about this patient wooden embrace. As the castle walls rose beyond the reach of men standing on the ground, the need for scaffolding became as critical as the need for stone itself. But this was not the crude framework of poles and planks that might suffice for simpler construction. Medieval scaffolding was an art form in itself, a temporary wooden city that had to be as carefully planned and constructed as the permanent stone structure it supported. The master carpenter approached scaffolding design with the same methodical care that the mason brought to wall construction. He understood that the safety of every worker on the project depended on the strength and stability of his wooden framework. More than that, the efficiency of the entire construction process relied on scaffolding that provided easy access to every part of the growing walls while allowing materials to be moved quickly and safely to where they were needed. The timber for scaffolding came from carefully selected trees, usually oak or pine, chosen for their straightness and freedom from knots that might create weak points under load. These trees were felled in winter when the sap was down, reducing the likelihood of warping and splitting as the wood seasoned. Each timber was examined carefully before use, tested for soundness by the carpenter's experienced hands and discerning eye. You don't need to focus on the technical details of scaffold construction. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of hammer and saw, the patient assembly of wooden frameworks that would support human dreams made manifest in stone. There's something deeply calming about this temporary architecture, built with the same care as permanent structures despite its destined impermanence. The scaffolding began with vertical posts driven deep into the ground or secured to the castle's foundation stones. These uprights had to be perfectly plumb, for any deviation from vertical would be multiplied as the scaffold rose, potentially creating dangerous instabilities at working height. The carpenter used a plumb bob, a simple weight suspended on a string, to ensure that each post stood exactly vertical, adjusting and readjusting until perfection was achieved. Horizontal ledgers connected the vertical posts, creating a framework of rectangular bays that could support working platforms. These ledgers were secured with wooden pegs and rope lashings, joints that could be quickly assembled but would hold firm under the weights and stresses of construction work. The spacing of ledgers was carefully calculated to support the loads they would bear without excessive deflection or springiness that might endanger workers. The working platforms themselves were constructed from thick oak planks, laid side by side with minimal gaps between them. These platforms had to support not just the weight of workers, but the heavy stones and buckets of mortar that were constantly being moved across them. The planks were secured to the ledgers with wooden pegs, or iron nails, creating surfaces stable enough for masons to work with confidence even at considerable heights. As the castle walls grew taller, the scaffolding grew with them, adding new levels and extending existing frameworks to match the rising stonework. This growth was carefully planned, each new level designed to support the construction of specific parts of the castle structure. The scaffolding had to anticipate not just current needs, but future requirements as walls rose and new architectural features demanded specialized support. There's something wonderfully organic about the way medieval scaffolding evolved with the building it supported, growing and changing like a living thing responding to the needs of construction. You may find yourself drifting as we watch this wooden framework take shape, its temporary nature somehow making it more rather than less beautiful, like flowers that bloom knowing their season is brief. The carpenters who built and maintained the scaffolding developed their own specialized skills and techniques. They learned to work at heights that would challenge modern construction workers, moving across their wooden frameworks with the confident ease of sailors in a ship's rigging. Their tools were simple but perfectly adapted to their work. Sharp axes for shaping timber, augers for boring holes, mallets for driving wooden pegs home. Rope played a crucial role in scaffold construction, not just for lifting materials, but as an integral part of the structure itself. Medieval rope, usually made from hemp or flax, was remarkably strong and durable when properly cared for. The carpenters learned to inspect their ropes regularly, checking for signs of wear or weakness that might compromise safety. Damaged rope was immediately replaced, for the carpenters understood that lives depended on the integrity of every component in their wooden framework. The scaffolding had to accommodate more than just the masons laying stone. Space was needed for the constant flow of materials, stones being lifted to working height, mortar buckets being carried to where they were needed, tools being moved from task to task. The carpenters designed their frameworks with wide platforms and multiple levels, creating highways in the air that allowed efficient movement of men and materials. Safety was always a primary concern in scaffold design, though medieval workers approached it differently than modern construction crews. Rather than relying on elaborate protective equipment, they depended on well-built scaffolding and careful work practices. The carpenters built their frameworks with generous safety margins, using more timber and stronger joints than minimal calculations might require. They understood that the cost of extra wood was insignificant compared to the cost of accident or injury. The scaffolding also had to protect the workers and the growing castle structure from weather. Canvas or leather coverings could be rigged to provide shelter from rain or snow, allowing work to continue even in less than ideal conditions. These temporary roofs were often ingeniously designed, sloping to shed water while providing maximum working space beneath. As different parts of the castle reached completion, sections of scaffolding were carefully dismantled and the timber reused elsewhere. This dismantling required as much skill as the original construction, for the carpenters had to remove their framework without damaging either the scaffolding timber or the completed stonework. Valuable timber was cleaned, sorted, and stored for future use, while damaged pieces were relegated to less critical applications. The relationship between the permanent stone structure and its temporary wooden support system was one of mutual dependence. The castle could not rise without the scaffolding, but the scaffolding had no purpose except to serve the castle. This symbiotic relationship created a unique form of architecture, the architecture of construction itself, as carefully planned and beautifully executed as the permanent structure it served. You don't need to remember every detail of scaffold design and construction. Just let yourself be comforted by the image of master craftsmen creating temporary wooden cities in the air, structures that would support the dreams and aspirations of an entire community. There's something deeply reassuring about this patient construction of the tools and platforms that would make greater construction possible. As scaffolding reached toward the patient sky, thoughts began to turn to the ancient challenge of moving heavy stones to impossible heights. Let's wander gently to where human ingenuity met medieval physics. The gentle giants, medieval cranes. High above the growing walls, great wooden wheels turned in steady rhythm, lifted by the patient steps of men who walked their circular path like monks in meditation. You may find yourself drifting with their gentle, repetitive motion. The medieval crane was perhaps the most ingenious of all construction devices, a marriage of simple mechanics and human power that could lift massive stones to heights that seemed to defy the limitations of muscle and wood. These great machines, built entirely from timber and rope, represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about leverage, balance, and the patient application of human strength to seemingly impossible tasks. The most common type of crane was the tread wheel crane, powered by men walking inside a large wooden, much like hamsters in their exercise wheels, though the comparison does no justice to the dignity and skill of the medieval crane operators. These men, known as treaders, developed specialized techniques for walking their circular path hour after hour, maintaining the steady rhythm that would lift stones weighing several tons to the tops of castle towers. The great wheel itself was a masterpiece of medieval carpentry, constructed from carefully selected oak timbers joined with wooden pegs and iron reinforcements. The wheel might be 12 feet or more in diameter, large enough for 2 or even 3 men to walk inside simultaneously. The interior surface was fitted with wooden treads, like the rungs of a horizontal ladder, providing secure footing for the operators even when the wheel was turning under load. You don't need to understand the complex mechanics of medieval cranes. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle rhythm of the great wheel turning. The patient steps of men whose work made possible the seemingly impossible task of raising massive stones to castle battlements. There's something deeply meditative about this human-powered machinery, where individual effort combined to create forces far greater than any single person could generate. The crane's lifting mechanism was elegantly simple. A rope wound around the wheel's axle, so that each revolution of the wheel drew up several feet of rope. At the end of this rope hung a tackle system, an arrangement of pulleys that multiplied the lifting force even further. Through this combination of wheel and pulley, 2 or 3 men walking steadily could lift stones that would require dozens of men using simpler methods. The treaders developed their own specialized skills and techniques. They learned to maintain exactly the right pace, fast enough to lift loads efficiently, slow enough to maintain control and avoid dangerous acceleration. They worked in teams, timing their steps so that the wheel turned smoothly without the jerky motion that could cause loads to swing dangerously or put excessive stress on the crane structure. The rhythm of the tread wheel became one of the characteristic sounds of castle construction, a steady creaking and turning that marked the ascent of stone after stone toward its destined place in the growing walls. This wasn't the harsh noise of industrial machinery, but rather the gentle, organic sound of wood working under load, punctuated by the soft footfalls of the treaders maintaining their patient pace. Different types of loads required different approaches to crane operation. Heavy foundation stones demanded slow, steady lifting with frequent pauses to check the security of rope and tackle. Lighter stones for upper courses could be lifted more quickly, but required careful control to position them precisely where the masons needed them. Delicate carved stones demanded the most skilled operators, men who could control their crane with the precision of a surgeon's hands. The crane operators developed an intimate knowledge of their machines, understanding by sound and feel when something was not quite right. A change in the wheel's creaking might indicate excessive load. An unusual vibration could warn of a developing problem in the tackle system. These subtle signals allowed them to prevent accidents before they occurred, protecting both workers and the valuable stones being lifted. You may find yourself drifting as we watch these patient craftsmen at their circular work, their steps marking the steady progress of stones rising like prayers toward the medieval sky. The treadwheel crane represented human cooperation at its most effective. Individual effort multiplied and focused to achieve results that seemed almost magical to those who witnessed them. The positioning of cranes around the construction site was a matter of careful planning. Each crane had to be positioned where it could serve the greatest area of wall construction while avoiding interference with other construction activities. The master carpenter responsible for crane placement studied the castle plans carefully, calculating the reach and capacity needed at each stage of construction. Some cranes were built on fixed foundations, massive timber frameworks that could support the heaviest lifting tasks. Others were designed to be moved as construction progressed, their bases fitted with wheels or rollers that allowed them to be repositioned as needed. The largest cranes were semi-permanent installations, substantial enough to remain in place throughout the years required to complete castle construction. The rope used in medieval cranes was itself a marvel of medieval technology. Made from hemp or flax fibers twisted into strands and then twisted again into finished rope, these lines had to support tremendous loads while remaining flexible enough to work smoothly through pulley systems. The rope makers who supplied castle construction projects were craftsmen as skilled in their way as the masons and carpenters, understanding how twist and tension affected strength and durability. Maintenance of the cranes was a constant concern. The wooden components had to be checked regularly for signs of wear or weakness. Rope was inspected for frayed spots or weakened sections that might fail under load. The pulley systems required regular lubrication with animal fat or vegetable oil to ensure smooth operation. This maintenance was not merely practical necessity. It was a matter of life and death for the workers who depended on the crane's reliable operation. The crane operators took pride in their specialized skills, developing techniques that were passed down from master to apprentice over generations. They learned to read the behavior of their machines, to sense when a load was properly balanced, to detect the first signs of mechanical problems before they became dangerous. Their work required not just physical strength, but mental alertness and technical understanding. Weather added another dimension to crane operation. Wind could make lifting dangerous, causing loads to swing unpredictably. Rain made wooden components slippery and increased the risk of accidents. Snow and ice created hazardous conditions that often brought lifting operations to a halt. The crane operators learned to work with weather rather than against it, timing their most challenging lifts for the calmest conditions. As stones found their way to ever greater heights, the walls themselves began to reveal their deeper purposes. Let us drift now to the heart of medieval defense, the wisdom of defensive design. In the minds of medieval architects, each wall told a story of protection, each curve and angle planned with the gentle wisdom of those who sought only to shelter what they loved. There's no need to focus on conflict, just appreciate the thoughtful care in every decision. The defensive features of medieval castles were not born from aggression or the desire for war, but rather from the peaceful impulse to protect home and family, community, and culture. The master mason and castle architect approached these elements with the same thoughtful care they brought to every other aspect of construction, seeking solutions that were both effective and beautiful, functional and dignified. The thickness of castle walls was the most obvious defensive feature, but it served purposes beyond simple strength. These massive walls, often 8 or 10 feet thick, provided excellent insulation against both weather and noise. The thick stone created comfortable interior temperatures year-round, while the massive material absorbed sound, creating the peaceful quiet that made castle chambers ideal for contemplation and rest. Within these thick walls, the architects created a network of passages and chambers that served the daily life of the castle community. Storage rooms tucked into wall thickness provided secure space for food, weapons, and valuable household goods. Spiral staircases wound through the walls, connecting different levels while taking up minimal space in the main chambers. These passages became highways within the walls, allowing servants and residents to move about their business without disrupting activities in the main rooms. You may find yourself drifting as we explore these peaceful defensive features, designed not for aggression, but for the quiet security that allowed families to sleep safely and communities to flourish in uncertain times. The arrow slits that pierced castle walls were narrow openings that provided excellent views of the surrounding countryside, while admitting just enough light to brighten interior chambers during the day. These slits, called loopholes by medieval builders, were marvels of practical engineering. Their narrow exterior openings made them difficult targets from outside, while their interior ends flared into comfortable recesses where defenders could stand with room to maneuver. But beyond their defensive purpose, these openings served as windows and walls too thick for conventional window construction, bringing light and air into spaces that might otherwise have been dark and stuffy. The design of castle doorways reflected the same thoughtful approach to security and beauty. Castle gates were marvels of medieval engineering, combining massive strength with surprising elegance. The doors themselves were often works of art, carved with decorative patterns and bound with ironwork that was both functional and beautiful. Multiple layers of security, portcullises, iron doors, wooden barriers, provided protection while creating impressive architectural features that welcomed friends while deterring unwelcome visitors. The approach to castle gates was carefully planned to create what architects call a defensible space, an area where visitors would be observed and evaluated before gaining entry to the castle proper. But this was not merely military planning. It was also architectural theater, creating impressive approaches that would awe visitors and demonstrate the wealth and power of the castle's lord. The same features that provided security also created drama and beauty. Towers served multiple purposes in castle design, rising above the walls to provide commanding views of the surrounding countryside. From these elevated positions, guards could spot approaching visitors hours before they reached the castle, allowing plenty of time for preparation and welcome. But towers were also living spaces, their upper chambers often serving as private apartments for the lord's family, offering privacy and the best views of the surrounding landscape. The spiral staircases within these towers were themselves defensive features, designed to favor defenders over attackers. The stairs curved clockwise as they ascended, allowing a right-handed defender coming down the stairs to swing his sword freely while forcing an attacker climbing up the stairs to fight with his sword arm cramped against the central column. But this practical feature also created beautiful architectural spaces, with the curving stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use becoming sculpture-like elements of great beauty. There's something wonderfully peaceful about these defensive features when viewed not as instruments of war, but as expressions of the human desire for security and beauty. You don't need to dwell on their martial purposes. Instead, let yourself appreciate the way medieval architects found beauty in function, creating features that serve practical needs while adding to the overall elegance of the structure. The placement of defensive features followed principles that were as much aesthetic as military. Towers were positioned not just for maximum defensive effectiveness, but to create pleasing proportions and impressive silhouettes against the sky. Wall thickness varied not just according to defensive needs, but to create interesting interior spaces and exterior visual rhythms. Every defensive feature was designed to contribute to the castle's overall architectural beauty. Water defenses, where geography permitted, were among the most effective and beautiful defensive features. Moats and water barriers served the practical purpose of making castle walls more difficult to approach, but they also created reflective surfaces that doubled the visual impact of the castle's architecture. The sight of a castle's towers reflected in still water was one of the most beautiful effects medieval architects could achieve. The integration of defensive features with daily life was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of castle design. Features that provided security also enhanced comfort and convenience. Thick walls provided both protection and insulation. High towers offered both defensive advantages and spectacular living spaces. Controlled approaches provided both security screening and impressive ceremonial entrances. The master mason responsible for incorporating defensive features into castle design had to balance multiple considerations. Every defensive element had to serve its protective purpose effectively, but it also had to integrate seamlessly with the castle's architectural beauty and contribute to the comfort and convenience of daily life. This required not just technical skill, but genuine architectural genius. Medieval castle builders understood that the best defense was often passive rather than active, features that deterred problems rather than responding to them. Impressive walls and towers often prevented conflicts simply by demonstrating the strength and determination of their builders. Beautiful and well-maintained castles showed that their owners were prosperous and well-organized, discouraging those who might prey on weakness. The psychological aspects of castle design were as important as the physical features. A castle that looked impregnable often never had to prove its strength in actual conflict. The appearance of strength and the reality of beauty combined to create structures that were both secure and welcoming, forbidding to enemies, but comfortable for friends and family. As defensive walls took their patient shape, attention turned to the rooms and spaces where actual life would unfold. Let's drift softly into the domestic heart of these stone dreams. Chambers of daily life. Within the embrace of growing stone walls, craftsmen began to carve out spaces for human comfort. Rooms where families would gather, where stories would be told by gentle firelight. Let these peaceful domestic visions carry you deeper into rest. As the outer defenses took their patient shape around the castle grounds, the true heart of these stone structures began to emerge in the quiet spaces within. Here, away from the business of walls and battlements, craftsmen turned their gentle attention to creating chambers where actual life would unfold, where children would learn their letters, where families would share their evening meals, where the soft murmur of daily conversation would echo through corridors for centuries to come. The great hall formed the beating heart of every castle, and its construction required a different kind of patience than the defensive walls. These vast rooms needed to accommodate not just the practical needs of medieval life, but also the social rhythms that would flow through them like gentle tides. Master builders planned these spaces with the careful attention of those who understood that architecture must serve the human spirit as much as the human body. You don't need to remember every detail of how these rooms took shape. Just let yourself drift along with the steady rhythm of craftsmen who worked with quiet dedication, knowing that their efforts would shelter generations of families yet unborn. There's something deeply soothing about watching these domestic spaces emerge from raw stone, like watching flowers bloom in slow motion through the patient seasons. The construction of interior walls required its own special techniques, different from the massive fortifications that face the outside world. These inner partitions needed to be strong enough to support the weight of upper floors, yet thin enough to maximize the precious space within the castle's stone embrace. Medieval builders developed an intimate understanding of how stone behaved in these gentler applications, learning to coax walls from smaller blocks with the same care a gardener might tend delicate seedlings. Doorways between chambers received particular attention, not just for their practical function, but for the sense of transition they would provide. Each threshold marked a passage from one aspect of daily life to another, from the public spaces where visitors might gather to the private chambers where families could retreat into quiet intimacy. The stonemasons who carved these openings worked with an almost reverent attention to proportion, understanding that people would pass through these spaces thousands of times over the coming centuries. Let your mind drift now with these patient craftsmen as they measured and fitted each stone with meditative precision. There's no urgency here, no need to hurry along with their progress. Medieval time moved at its own gentle pace, and there was wisdom in allowing each element to settle into its proper place without rushing toward completion. The chambers designated for sleeping required their own thoughtful considerations. Privacy was a precious commodity in medieval life, and the stone walls that divided these spaces needed to provide both physical separation and acoustic comfort. Builders learned to create walls that would muffle the sounds of daily life, while still allowing the gentle circulation of air that would keep these rooms comfortable through long winter nights and warm summer days. Windows in these interior chambers posed fascinating challenges for medieval builders. Unlike the narrow arrow slits designed for defense, these openings needed to welcome light and air while still maintaining the structural integrity of the walls. Craftsmen developed elegant solutions, creating window openings that were both functional and beautiful, often incorporating stone seats where residents could sit and gaze out at the peaceful countryside beyond their walls. As you listen to the quiet tap-tap-tapping of chisels on stone, you might find yourself growing more relaxed, more ready to let these gentle sounds carry you toward peaceful rest. The rhythm of medieval construction had its own hypnotic quality, a steady percussion that marked the slow transformation of raw materials into spaces designed for human comfort and happiness. The kitchen chambers required perhaps the most complex planning of all the domestic spaces. These rooms needed to accommodate not just the preparation of food, but also the social aspects of medieval cooking, the gathering of servants and family members, the storage of provisions, and the careful management of fire and smoke. Stone masons working on these spaces needed to coordinate closely with other craftsmen, ensuring that their walls would properly support the massive fireplaces and ovens that would soon fill these chambers with the warm aromas of daily meals. Storage chambers received their own careful attention, though these spaces were designed more for function than beauty. Medieval families needed secure places to keep their precious belongings, grain stores that would remain dry through wet seasons, wine cellars that would maintain steady temperatures, and treasure rooms where valuable items could rest safely behind thick stone walls. The builders who created these utilitarian spaces worked with the same patient dedication as those crafting the grand halls, understanding that every chamber served an important role in the castle's domestic life. Private chambers for the lord and lady of the castle demanded the finest attention to detail. These rooms would serve as offices, bedrooms, and private retreats, spaces where important decisions would be made and intimate family moments would unfold. The stonework in these chambers often incorporated decorative elements, carved window frames, ornate door surrounds, and carefully planned proportions that would create spaces worthy of their important occupants. You don't need to focus on every technical detail. Just let yourself be carried along by the gentle persistence of these medieval craftsmen as they slowly, carefully, patiently transformed cold stone into warm, welcoming living spaces. There's something deeply comforting about this process, this gradual emergence of human-scaled rooms from massive walls of rock. Chapel chambers within the castle walls received their own reverent attention. These sacred spaces needed to provide both spiritual comfort and acoustic properties that would enhance prayer and singing. Medieval builders understood that these rooms would host some of the most important moments in the lives of castle residents: christenings, marriages, and quiet moments of personal prayer. The stonework in these chambers often incorporated subtle details that would enhance the sense of spiritual peace. Curved walls that would carry voices gently upward, window placements that would welcome morning light during daily prayers. As the interior chambers slowly took shape, craftsmen began to consider the flow of movement between rooms. Medieval castles were designed to accommodate the complex social hierarchies of their time, with pathways that would allow servants to move efficiently through their duties while providing private routes for family members. The placement of doorways and the width of corridors reflected centuries of experience in creating functional living spaces within stone walls. The gentle sound of mortar being spread between stones provides its own soothing rhythm. You might find your breathing naturally synchronizing with these patient construction sounds as skilled hands guide each block into its destined position. There's no need to stay awake for every detail. Just let these peaceful medieval sounds carry you softly toward rest. Guest chambers required their own thoughtful planning, as hospitality was a sacred duty in medieval culture. These rooms needed to provide comfort for visitors while reflecting the status and generosity of their hosts. Builders creating these spaces worked with particular care, knowing that the quality of these chambers would speak to travelers about the character of the families who welcomed them within their castle walls. As morning light filtered through those early planning chambers, other minds were already turning to the ancient knowledge that would guide their hands. Let's drift now to where the wisdom began. As these living spaces found their patient shapes within the growing castle walls, the most vital element of castle life began to demand attention: the precious flow of water that would bring these stone chambers to life. Let us wander now to where water found its patient way through stone, the poetry of medieval plumbing. Through channels carved in patient stone, clear water began its eternal journey, following paths planned by minds that understood the gentle persistence of flowing streams. You don't need to remember the technical details, just feel the soothing presence of water finding its way. Water is perhaps the most patient element in all of creation, and medieval builders learned to work with its gentle persistence rather than against it. In the quiet early hours before dawn, master craftsmen would stand beside natural springs and streams, listening to the soft murmur of flowing water as they planned the intricate systems that would bring this life-giving element into their growing stone structures. The search for water often began years before the first foundation stones were laid. Castle builders needed to locate reliable sources that would flow through even the driest summers and the coldest winters. They would spend entire seasons observing the landscape, noting where morning dew lingered longest, where the grass grew greenest, where the subtle signs of underground streams revealed themselves to patient eyes. Let yourself drift now with these quiet observers as they walked the gentle hills and valleys, their experienced eyes reading the landscape like an ancient text. There's something deeply peaceful about this patient searching, this careful attention to the natural world's subtle messages. You don't need to follow every detail. Just feel the calm rhythm of feet walking across dewy morning grass, searching for the perfect water source. Wells represented the most reliable method of securing water within castle walls, and their construction required both engineering skill and an almost mystical understanding of how water moved through rock and soil. Medieval well diggers were artists in their own right, capable of following underground streams through dozens of feet of earth and stone. They worked with simple tools but extraordinary patience, descending deeper into the earth day by day, always listening for the first gentle sound of water seeping through stone. The actual digging of a well took on an almost meditative quality. Day after day, workers would descend into the growing shaft, removing soil and rock one careful basket at a time. The walls of the well needed to be lined with fitted stones, each one carefully shaped to hold back the earth while allowing the precious water to seep through. This work required absolute precision. A single poorly fitted stone could compromise the entire system. You might find yourself growing drowsy as you imagine the gentle sound of water slowly filling these patient stone channels. The rhythm of medieval water systems had its own hypnotic quality, a soft murmuring that would echo through castle corridors for centuries, providing both practical function and peaceful background music to daily life. Aqueducts and water channels required different skills, but the same patient dedication. Medieval engineers learned to calculate gradients so subtle that water would flow steadily, but never rush, moving through stone channels with the same gentle persistence it had shown in natural streams. These channels often traveled remarkable distances, following the contours of hillsides and valleys, sometimes disappearing underground for long stretches before emerging again within the castle walls. The construction of these water channels demanded extraordinary precision. Each section needed to be perfectly aligned with those before and after, maintaining a consistent slope that would encourage water to flow without allowing it to rush so quickly that it would erode the carefully crafted stone. Medieval builders developed techniques for testing these systems, sending small amounts of water through completed sections to ensure that their calculations were correct. Drainage systems received equal attention, though their purpose was to guide water away rather than welcome it in. Medieval builders understood that standing water could weaken stone foundations and create unhealthy conditions within living spaces. They created elaborate networks of channels and drains that would carry away rainwater and waste, following natural drainage patterns while maintaining the structural integrity of the castle walls. The gentle sound of water moving through these ancient drainage systems created its own peaceful symphony. You don't need to understand the technical complexities. Just let yourself be soothed by the image of clear water following paths carved by patient hands centuries ago, still flowing gently through channels that medieval craftsmen created with loving attention to detail. Private chambers often included their own water features. Wash basins supplied by small channels that branched off from the main system, or even primitive indoor plumbing systems that brought running water directly to living spaces. These luxury features required extraordinary skill to construct, as they needed to function reliably while remaining hidden within the castle's stone walls. Cisterns for storing rainwater represented another marvel of medieval engineering. These underground chambers were carved from solid rock or built with carefully fitted stones, designed to collect and store precipitation from roof systems and courtyard areas. The construction of these storage systems required perfect waterproofing. Even the smallest leak could drain away precious water reserves. As water found its secure paths through the growing castle, attention naturally turned to another essential element of comfortable living. Let's drift now to where fire found its home in stone. Hearths and the taming of fire. In carefully crafted stone hearths, fire found its gentle home, warming generations of families who would gather in the golden glow of burning logs. There's something deeply comforting about these patient flames, forever reaching upward through medieval chimneys. Fire was both servant and master in medieval life, and the builders who learned to contain it within stone chambers possessed knowledge that bordered on the magical. The construction of hearths and chimneys required an understanding not just of stone and mortar, but of how flame and smoke behaved, how heat moved through different materials, and how to create the perfect balance between warmth and safety. The placement of hearths within castle chambers demanded careful consideration of both practical and social needs. These fires would serve as gathering points for families and guests, places where stories would be shared and important conversations would unfold in the dancing light of burning logs. Medieval builders learned to position these hearths so that their warmth would reach every corner of a room, while their light would create comfortable spaces for both intimate conversations and larger gatherings. Let yourself relax now as you imagine the gentle crackling of logs settling into glowing embers. The sound of medieval fires had its own hypnotic rhythm, a soft percussion of wood expanding and contracting in the heat, punctuated by the occasional gentle pop of sap meeting flame. There's no need to focus on technical details. Just allow these peaceful fire sounds to carry you deeper into rest. The construction of fireboxes required extraordinary skill in working with heat-resistant materials. Medieval builders learned to line these chambers with special fire bricks or carefully selected stones that could withstand the constant expansion and contraction caused by heating and cooling. They developed techniques for creating fireboxes that would draw air efficiently while reflecting maximum heat back into the living spaces they served. Chimney construction represented perhaps the most complex challenge in medieval heating systems. These vertical channels needed to carry smoke safely away from living spaces while creating enough draft to keep fires burning cleanly. The internal dimensions of chimneys required precise calculation. Too narrow, and they would not draw properly. Too wide, and the precious heat would escape without warming the rooms below. Medieval chimney builders developed an almost intuitive understanding of how smoke behaved in different weather conditions. They learned to create internal features that would prevent downdrafts during storms while maintaining consistent airflow during calm weather. Some chimneys included ingenious baffles and turns that would help regulate the flow of smoke while preventing rain from reaching the fires below. The gentle upward movement of warm air through these ancient chimneys created its own peaceful rhythm. You might find yourself naturally breathing more slowly and deeply as you imagine smoke rising lazily through medieval flues, carrying with it the comfortable aromas of burning hardwood and the quiet contentment of families gathered around their evening fires. Different rooms required different approaches to heating. Great halls with their soaring ceilings needed massive fireplaces capable of producing enormous amounts of heat, while private chambers could be warmed by smaller, more intimate hearths. Kitchen fires needed to be designed for cooking as well as heating, with features that would support the pots and spits required for meal preparation. The decoration of hearth surrounds provided opportunities for craftsmen to display their artistic skills while creating functional beauty. Stone masons would carve elaborate designs into the blocks that framed fireplace openings, creating visual focal points that would enhance the social importance of these gathering spaces. These decorative elements often included family coats of arms, religious symbols, or natural motifs that reflected the tastes and values of the castle's inhabitants. Fuel storage systems required their own careful planning. Castle builders needed to create spaces where large quantities of firewood could be stored safely while remaining accessible to servants who would tend the fires throughout long winter months. These storage areas needed to remain dry to prevent the wood from rotting, while being positioned to minimize the distance fuel would need to be carried to individual hearths. Some of the most sophisticated castle heating systems included hypocausts, underground chambers where fires would heat air that would then circulate through hollow spaces within walls and floors. These systems, adapted from Roman models, required extraordinary engineering skill and provided remarkably even heating throughout entire sections of castle structures. You don't need to remember every detail of these complex heating systems. Just let yourself be warmed by the image of medieval fires burning peacefully in their stone chambers, providing comfort and gathering places for countless generations of families. There's something timelessly soothing about the thought of flames dancing in carefully crafted hearths, their warm light flickering across ancient stone walls. The maintenance of these heating systems required constant attention from skilled craftsmen. Chimneys needed regular cleaning to prevent dangerous buildup of combustible materials, while hearths required periodic repair as the constant heating and cooling gradually wore away even the most carefully selected stones. This ongoing maintenance created its own gentle rhythm in castle life, with the quiet sounds of craftsmen tending to these essential systems. As warmth settled into the stone bones of these patient structures, attention turned to the crowning achievements that would define the skyline. Let's drift upward now to where towers kissed the patient sky, towers reaching toward dreams. Stone by careful stone, towers began their slow climb toward the stars, each course bringing the structure closer to touching the medieval sky. You may already be drifting off as we ascend with these patient builders. Of all the elements in medieval castle construction, towers represented the greatest marriage of practical necessity and architectural ambition. These soaring structures served multiple purposes: watchtowers for observing the surrounding countryside, defensive strongholds during times of trouble, and powerful symbols of the nobility who commissioned them. Yet their construction required solving engineering challenges that pushed medieval building techniques to their absolute limits. The decision to build a tower began long before the first stones were laid, often during the earliest planning stages when architects and builders would stand on the proposed site, gazing upward at the empty sky and envisioning the structure that would someday grace that space. These dreamers needed to balance their ambitions against the practical realities of medieval engineering, creating structures that would be both impressive and stable. Let your thoughts drift upward now with these medieval visionaries as they plan their reaching towers. There's something wonderfully peaceful about this patient dreaming, this careful imagining of stone structures that would stand against the sky for centuries to come. You don't need to follow every technical detail. Just feel the gentle ambition of builders who wanted to create something truly lasting and beautiful. Foundation work for towers required even more precision than that needed for walls or other castle structures. These tall buildings would concentrate enormous weight on relatively small foundation areas, and the base stones needed to be perfectly level and absolutely solid. Medieval builders often dug tower foundations deeper than those for any other castle structures, sometimes reaching down through soil and softer rock until they found bedrock capable of supporting the tremendous loads above. The geometry of tower construction followed ancient principles that medieval builders inherited from Roman and earlier traditions. Circular towers were generally stronger than square ones, as curved walls could better distribute the stresses created by their own weight and by external forces like wind or earth tremors. However, square towers were easier to build and provided more usable interior space, leading to ongoing debates among medieval architects about which approach was superior. Each course of stones in a rising tower needed to be perfectly level, as even small irregularities would compound as the structure gained height, potentially creating dangerous instabilities. Medieval builders developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining level courses, using water-filled troughs and other simple but effective tools to ensure that each ring of stones was absolutely horizontal before the next course was begun. The gentle, repetitive rhythm of tower construction had its own meditative quality. Stone after stone, course after course, rising slowly toward the patient sky with the same steady progression that marks the changing seasons or the quiet passage of years. You might find yourself breathing more slowly as you imagine this patient vertical journey, this gradual transformation of earthbound materials into structures that would touch the clouds. Internal planning for towers required extraordinary foresight, as these structures would contain multiple levels connected by narrow spiral staircases carved directly from stone. Medieval builders needed to plan these circulation systems before construction began, as the stairways would be integrated into the tower walls themselves. These spiral stairs almost always turned clockwise as they ascended, giving right-handed defenders an advantage if enemies managed to breach the tower's lower levels. Windows in towers posed unique challenges, as these openings needed to provide light and observation opportunities while maintaining structural strength. Tower windows were typically narrow and deeply recessed, designed to minimize the weakening effect on the walls while maximizing the defensive advantages they provided. The stonework around these openings required extraordinary precision, as any flaws could create weak points that might compromise the entire structure. Different levels within towers served different functions, and builders needed to accommodate these varied uses while maintaining structural integrity. Lower levels might serve as storage areas or defensive positions. Middle levels could house living quarters or meeting rooms, while upper levels typically functioned as observation posts or signal stations. Each level required different ceiling heights, different window arrangements, and different internal features. The construction of floors within towers required careful integration with the stone walls, as wooden beams needed to be securely anchored into the masonry without creating weak points. Medieval builders developed techniques for creating stone supports that would distribute the weight of floors and their contents safely into the tower walls, while providing secure attachment points for the wooden structural elements. You don't need to climb every step of these rising towers. Just let yourself be carried gently upward by the patient work of medieval craftsmen who understood that great achievements come through steady, consistent effort rather than rushed ambition. There's something deeply soothing about this methodical approach to building, this careful attention to each individual stone and structures that would stand for centuries. Roofing systems for towers require their own specialized techniques, as these elevated structures would face the full fury of medieval weather. Tower roofs needed to shed rain and snow effectively while withstanding the powerful winds that could develop at height. Many towers were topped with conical roofs that would deflect wind while providing attractive crowns for these soaring structures. The final stages of tower construction often included the installation of bells or other signaling devices that would communicate with other castles or settlements across the medieval landscape. These additions required careful consideration of weight distribution and structural support, as the forces generated by swinging bells could potentially damage tower walls if not properly accommodated. As towers found their destined heights, attention turned to the protective crowns that would shelter the brave souls who kept watch. Let's wander gently to where stone met sky. Battlements and stone crowns. At the very top of patient stone walls, craftsmen carved the gentle teeth of battlements, creating a stone crown that would weather centuries of quiet seasons. There's no need to think of conflict. Just appreciate the geometric beauty of these ancient patterns. The crowning elements of medieval castle walls represented some of the most distinctive and recognizable features of these ancient structures. Battlements, with their rhythmic pattern of solid stone sections alternating with open spaces, created skylines that have captured imaginations for centuries. Yet their construction required both artistic sensibility and practical engineering knowledge, as these elevated features needed to serve functional purposes while creating beautiful architectural statements. The planning of battlements began with careful consideration of proportions and spacing. Medieval builders understood that the alternating pattern of solid merlons and open crenels needed to follow mathematical relationships that would create both visual harmony and practical functionality. The width of the solid sections, the size of the gaps between them, and the overall height of the parapet all required careful calculation to achieve the perfect balance. Let yourself drift now with the patient craftsmen who shaped these stone crowns, working high above the ground with steady hands and careful attention to detail. There's something wonderfully peaceful about imagining this elevated work, with builders surrounded by sky and gentle breezes, creating patterns that would define these structures' silhouettes for centuries to come. The construction of individual merlons required extraordinary skill in stone cutting and fitting. Each of these solid sections needed to be perfectly vertical and properly integrated with the wall structure below, while providing stable platforms for the wooden shutters or other protective devices that would sometimes be installed in the crenels. The tops of merlons were typically covered with coping stones that would shed rainwater while creating clean, finished lines. Crenels, the open spaces between merlons, needed to be sized and positioned to serve their intended functions while maintaining the structural integrity of the parapet. These openings allowed observers to monitor the surrounding countryside and provided positions for defensive equipment if needed. But they also created gaps in the wall structure that required careful engineering to ensure stability. The walkways behind battlements, known as wall walks or ramparts, required their own careful construction. These elevated paths needed to provide safe, level surfaces for people to move along the tops of walls, while being properly integrated with both the wall structure below and the battlements above. Medieval builders learned to create subtle drainage systems that would prevent water from pooling on these exposed surfaces. You might find yourself growing more relaxed as you imagine the gentle rhythm of craftsmen working on these elevated stone features. The repetitive nature of battlement construction, Merlin after Merlin, crenel after crenel, created its own meditative cadence, like a stone poem written against the medieval sky. There's no need to focus on every detail. Just feel the peaceful repetition of skilled hands shaping stone into beautiful, functional patterns. Corners and turns in battlement lines required special attention, as these junctions needed to maintain both the visual rhythm of the pattern and the structural stability of the wall system. Medieval builders developed elegant solutions for these transitions, often creating slightly larger corner merlins or adjusting the spacing of crenels to accommodate the geometric requirements of changing directions. The integration of towers with battlement systems posed interesting design challenges. Where tower walls met curtain walls, the battlement patterns needed to flow smoothly from one structure to another while accommodating the different heights and angles involved. Master builders developed standardized approaches to these transitions, creating architectural languages that would be repeated across multiple castle projects. Different regional traditions developed distinctive battlement styles, with varying proportions, decorative elements, and construction techniques. Some areas favored tall, narrow merlins with small crenels, while others preferred lower, broader patterns with generous openings. These regional variations reflected both practical considerations related to local building materials and aesthetic preferences that developed over generations of construction experience. The weatherproofing of battlements required ongoing attention throughout the life of castle structures. These elevated features faced the full force of rain, snow, and wind, and medieval builders needed to incorporate drainage details and protective elements that would prevent water damage while maintaining the clean lines of the architectural design. Coping stones, lead flashings, and carefully planned slopes all played roles in protecting these prominent features. Some battlements incorporated decorative elements that went beyond basic functional requirements. Carved details, heraldic symbols, and architectural embellishments transformed simple defensive features into artistic statements that reflected the tastes and status of castle owners. These decorative additions required extraordinary skill from stone carvers, who worked at dangerous heights to create details that would be visible from great distances. The gentle sound of wind moving through completed battlements created its own peaceful music. You don't need to stay alert for every detail of construction. Just let yourself be soothed by the image of these stone crowns, standing patient and beautiful against changing skies, their regular patterns creating visual rhythms that have pleased human eyes for countless generations. Access to battlements typically involved narrow stone staircases built into wall structures or tower interiors. These steps needed to be carefully planned and expertly constructed, as they would be used frequently by people carrying equipment or supplies to the elevated positions. The integration of these access systems with the overall wall design required careful coordination between different craftsmen working on various aspects of the project. Lighting considerations affected battlement design, as these elevated positions would sometimes be used during nighttime hours. Medieval builders learned to incorporate features that would provide wind protection for torches or lanterns, while ensuring that artificial light sources would not create dangerous fire hazards in these exposed positions. With stone work nearing completion, thoughts turned to the final details that would transform mere walls into true homes. Let us drift now to where art met architecture: gates, bridges, and gentle entrances. Where castle walls met the outside world, craftsmen built welcoming gateways, structures designed not for war, but for the joyful return of family and friends. You don't need to focus on defensive purposes. Just imagine the happy reunions these gates would witness. In the final stages of castle construction, attention turned to the most welcoming elements of these great stone structures, the gates and bridges that would connect the completed fortress to the world beyond its walls. These entrance systems represented the culmination of years of patient labor. The gentle transition zones where the castle's protective embrace would open to welcome loved ones home. The construction of gatehouse complexes required a delicate balance between strength and hospitality. These structures needed to be robust enough to support heavy wooden gates and the machinery that would operate them, yet beautiful enough to create impressive first impressions for visitors approaching the completed castle. Medieval builders understood that these entrance features would be among the most frequently seen elements of their work, visible to every person who approached the castle grounds. Let yourself drift now with the craftsmen who worked on these final, welcoming details. There's something deeply satisfying about this completion phase of construction, when all the patient work of previous years finally comes together in structures designed to bring people together rather than keep them apart. You may already be growing drowsy as we near the end of our long journey through medieval building techniques. The great wooden gates themselves represented masterpieces of medieval carpentry, though their construction required close coordination with the stone masons who built the gatehouse structures. These massive barriers needed to fit perfectly within stone openings, hanging from iron hinges that were themselves embedded deep within carefully prepared masonry. The cooperation between woodworkers and stone craftsmen in creating these systems demonstrated the collaborative spirit that characterized all aspects of medieval castle construction. Drawbridge mechanisms, where they were included, represented some of the most sophisticated engineering achievements in medieval construction. These movable bridges needed to span defensive ditches while remaining light enough to be raised and lowered by human power alone. The stone foundations that supported drawbridge machinery required extraordinary precision, as even small misalignments could prevent these systems from operating smoothly. The gentle creaking of wooden bridges settling under their own weight created its own peaceful soundtrack. You don't need to understand the complex mechanics. Just let yourself be soothed by the thought of these patient wooden structures, weathered by countless seasons yet still faithfully serving their purpose of bringing people safely across water or empty space to the welcoming gates beyond. Approach roads and pathways received their own careful attention during these final construction phases. Medieval builders understood that the journey toward a castle gate was part of the overall experience, and they crafted these approaches to create impressive views while providing practical access for visitors, supplies, and the daily traffic of castle life. These paths were often paved with carefully fitted stones, creating durable surfaces that would serve travelers for centuries. The positioning of gates within the overall castle design reflected deep understanding of both practical and social considerations. Main gates needed to be easily accessible to welcome legitimate visitors, yet positioned to provide maximum security when needed. Secondary gates, often called postern gates, provided discreet access for residents and servants, allowing daily life to continue without disrupting the formal entrance protocols associated with main gateways. Decorative elements around gate openings provided opportunities for master craftsmen to display their finest skills. Stone carvers would create elaborate surrounds featuring family heraldry, religious symbols, or artistic motifs that reflected the tastes and values of castle owners. These decorative features transformed functional openings into artistic statements that would impress visitors and express the cultural sophistication of the families who commissioned them. You might find your breathing naturally slowing as you imagine these final decorative touches being added to structures that had taken so many years to complete. There's something wonderfully calming about this finishing work. These gentle artistic details that would welcome countless generations of visitors through gates that medieval craftsmen built with such patient attention to both beauty and function. The interior passages within gatehouse complexes often included features designed to create dramatic transitions from the outside world to the protected spaces within castle walls. These passages might curve gently to create mystery and anticipation, or open suddenly into courtyards that would surprise visitors with their beauty and scale. Medieval builders understood the psychological impact of these architectural sequences and crafted them to create memorable experiences for everyone who passed through. Guest quarters within gatehouse structures provided comfortable accommodation for visitors who might arrive late in the day or during inclement weather. These rooms needed to offer hospitality worthy of castle owners while remaining secure and easily supervised. The construction of these spaces required the same attention to comfort and detail that characterized the finest chambers within the castle's main structures. As these final elements of castle construction neared completion, the great stone structures began to take on their true character as homes rather than mere buildings. The gates and bridges represented the transition points where architectural achievement met human life, where the patient work of countless craftsmen finally found its purpose in serving the daily needs of families and communities. The sounds of completed castles settling into their landscape created their own gentle symphony. The soft echo of footsteps on stone pavements, the quiet murmur of conversations in courtyards, the gentle splash of water in fountains, and the peaceful creak of wooden gates opening to welcome friends and family home. These sounds would continue for centuries, a living testament to the skill and dedication of medieval builders. Maintenance of gate systems required ongoing attention from skilled craftsmen, creating employment for carpenters, blacksmiths, and stonemasons who would tend to these vital systems throughout the castle's active life. This continuing care ensured that the welcoming function of these entrance features would remain reliable for generation after generation of castle inhabitants. The completion of gates and entrance systems marked the true end of castle construction projects that had consumed years of patient labor. As the last stones were fitted into place and the final wooden elements were installed and tested, entire communities could celebrate the achievement of creating structures that would serve as homes, fortresses, and symbols of permanence for centuries to come. Let yourself rest now in the satisfaction of work well completed. These patient medieval craftsmen, whose names we may never know, but whose skills created wonders that still stand today, finally stepped back from their completed work and saw that it was good. Their castle gates stood ready to welcome countless future generations, opening and closing with the gentle rhythm of daily life, marking the comings and goings of families, friends, and travelers. The great stone structures, now complete from their deepest foundations to their highest battlements, settled into the landscape with the quiet dignity of permanent things. Through their welcoming gates would pass centuries of human stories. Children taking their first steps across ancient thresholds, couples beginning new lives together, travelers finding shelter and hospitality, and families gathering for celebrations that would echo through stone corridors built to last for ages. And so these ancient stones continue their patient watch, their gates still marking the boundary between the wide world and the protected spaces within. The medieval craftsmen who built them with such care have long since returned to dust, but their gentle legacy remains in every perfectly fitted stone, every graceful arch, every welcoming gateway that still opens to receive visitors with the same quiet dignity that characterized their creators. Rest now, and let these peaceful images of completed castles carry you softly into dreams. In your sleep, you might hear the gentle echo of medieval footsteps crossing ancient thresholds, or feel the solid comfort of stone walls that have sheltered countless generations of dreamers just like you. The patient work of those long-ago builders continues still, providing peaceful shelter for your imagination as you drift into restful sleep, surrounded by the quiet strength of stones that were laid with love and built to last forever. Sleep well, and dream of gates opening to welcome you home.